again, and welcome to a second session on a study of the book of Revelation. My name is Keith Mosher, Sr. I happen to be one of the instructors at the Memphis School of Preaching, as you know, and have been there for 47 years. We come to you today from the studios of the Gospel Broadcasting Network. If you're not already supporting this great work, I would implore you so to do. It is such a great work, reaching all over the world. In fact, in many of the books that we have been able to exegete on this format, we have received personally letters from around the world asking questions and commenting on the work itself. We have been able to do Isaiah, Daniel, Luke, Galatians, and Romans as studies on this particular format, and also a study of the general biblical introduction material on inspiration, canonicity, and textual criticism. And I'm so grateful to Don Blackwell, who does the directing of this work. A great director, has brought this work to a great period in its history. We're grateful for him and the work he does. He himself has overcome many obstacles. He's a great gospel preacher and a very faithful brother in Christ. And he and his wife have done great work all over the world for the Lord. And I'm hopeful that I will see him again in Paducah, Kentucky this year, where we have enjoyed being together for many years. On our last session, we talked a little bit in general terms about this kind of literature, apocalyptic literature, coded literature, literature filled with imagery and symbols and all kinds of things. But it's our intention in this session to pay attention to what is a big argument about this book, its date. When was it written? And this has become a difficulty for so many. And some folks have made this a matter of fellowship. We have in our library at home, or at the office, 21, at least 21, and maybe more than that, commentaries on Revelation. And there's quite a bit said in them about the dating of the book. And the view they take of this book, if it's a futurist, a premillennialist, he's going to have you looking at some 1,000-year reign in the future. Then there are those among us who take a historical view. That is, this book covered everything from the time it was written until the end of history. And they read into it even World War II and that kind of thing. Well, that's interesting. But generally speaking, there are two dates that are argued. And I want to beg those who hold to these dates, think carefully about making this a matter of fellowship. We don't have a Bible verse that gives us the date. That would mean to me that God was not so much interested in the date as the message. If I'll pay attention to verse 1, I'll know that I can't take this to the end of history. It says, shortly come to pass and things at hand. That would eliminate that view immediately. It would eliminate the futurist view immediately, logically speaking. But there are those who hold to a date, an early date we call it, AD 68. They base that on a statement in the Syriac Peshitta, the Common Aramaic Bible, at the head of the book of Revelation, written from Patmos in AD 68. They also argue that Jerusalem was still standing, chapter 11, verse 1. At this period, they also know there was great unrest, rebellion, earthquakes, famines, plagues, and misery untold. They also argue that the number of the beast indicates AD 68. And their argument also includes the thought that this date best fits the history of the events mentioned in the book. They're also convinced that this is Jewish persecution in the book. And they use that, chapter 6, for that kind of proof. Then there are those that take an AD 96 view. They are impressed with how much time it would have taken for Laodicea, in fact, to have been rebuilt. It had been destroyed by an earthquake, and to come to its place in history. It will also have taken some time for Sardis to be dead. Now, the counter-argument to that is quite easily seen from Galatians 3, where they were so soon removed from the gospel, so it doesn't take a lot of time, really, for apostasy. And so maybe that's not a really good argument. But John was banished. Now, that kind of persecution was done under Domitian, not Nero. And so that's a strong argument for a later date. The church had endured persecution in the past, Revelation 20, verse 4. And I want to read about that in just a moment, about the Jewish persecution of the church. But the Roman Empire, sitting on 7 hills, Revelation 17:11. That city was sitting on 7 hills. Well, Jerusalem sits on 1 hill. So that would be a kind of thorn in the side of those who take the early date, I'm sure. But my date is near the end of Domitian's reign, around AD 96. But let's think about Roman and Jewish persecution for a moment. And I'm reading to you from a man, not a member of the church, who wrote the following in his commentary. In the Revelation, there is a completely new attitude to Rome and to the Roman Empire. In the Acts, it is true that the tribunal of the Roman magistrate was often the safest refuge for the Christian missionaries against the hatred of the Jews and the fury of that mob. Paul was proud that he was a Roman citizen and claimed the rights of citizenship to which every Roman citizen was entitled. In Philippi, he brought the local magistrates to heel by revealing that he was a Roman citizen. Acts 16, 36 through 40. In Corinth, Gallio dismissed the complaints against Paul with impartial Roman justice. Acts 18, 1 through 17. In Ephesus, the Roman authorities were careful for the safety of Paul against the rioting mob. Acts 19, 13 through 41. In Jerusalem, the Roman tribune rescued Paul from what might have become a lynching. Acts 21, 30 through 41. 30 through 40. When the Roman tribune in Jerusalem heard that there was to be an attempt on Paul's life on the way to Caesarea, he took every possible caution and appealed for every possible step to spare Paul's life and ensure his safety. Acts 23, 12 through 31. When Paul despaired of justice in Palestine, he exercised his right as a citizen and appealed directly to Caesar. Acts 25, 10 and 11. And in fact, when Paul wrote to the Romans, he urged them to obey every ordinance because the powers that be were ordered of God. Romans 13, 1 through 3. Peter's advice was exactly the same, that governors and kings were to be obeyed. 1 Peter 2, 11 through 17. And the Thessalonians were told, 2 Thessalonians 2, 7, to obey those who were over them. But in the Revelation, there's nothing but hatred for a city sitting on 7 hills. A Babylon, a mother of harlots, drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs. That would have taken some time to get there. Revelation 17, 5 through 11. John hopes for the total destruction of Rome. The early testimony, to me, makes the decision that it was the late date that this was written. Why? In the last century, conservative scholars adopted the Neroan date. But the modern opinion has swung to the late date. My friend Curtis A. Cates moved from the early date to the late date, taking a good hard look at the early date. Well, what was that all about? Let's think about the traditional dating, AD 96. And external arguments and internal arguments, to me, favor the reign of Domitian for this writing. Now, the external witnesses begin with a man named Irenaeus, who died in AD 180. Now, he went through Polycarp all the way back to Papias for the residence of John in Asia Minor. And he said of the apocalyptic vision that vision was sent not very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. Now that's Irenaeus' witness. That's in Against Heresies, Volume 5, Section 30. Well, you could add to that testimony Clement of Alexandria in his book, Who is the Rich? And Jerome, Lives of Illustrious Men, that was the end of Domitian's reign that John wrote. The only exception to this dating was Epiphanius. He put it in Claudius' time, way too early. And then Dorotheus, who misunderstood Irenaeus, who he thought that John was exiled in Trajan's reign. And he couldn't read Domitian, evidently. And some have read Domitianus as being Nero. And so they have used that for the early date. The internal evidence is quite strong for the late date. The condition of the churches in Asia Minor, Turkey, are not the same as they were in the 50s and 60s, according to Acts of the Apostles, which I've already read to you. There were new opponents to the church by this time, the Nicolaitans, a sect of the Gnostics. There were new internal problems, Jezebel, and the threat of death because of refusal to worship an emperor. Emperor worship is late, not early. Leaving their first love, growing cold. There's some passing of time there for sure, although so soon removed could be the answer to that, I suppose. There's no evidence, however, no historical evidence at all for emperor worship in Nero's time. A.D. Knox' definitive treatment of emperor worship in the Cambridge Ancient History, Volume 10, makes note of when that actually took place. The existence of the church at Laodicea recovering from an earthquake, and the wealth of time it would have taken to make that city again, gives me a late date idea. And Tacitus said that city was destroyed by an earthquake in AD 60. Well, they didn't rebuild it in 68. Now, let's back up a moment and give some arguments for the early date. An argument is made about the literary style of this book. And I remember an expert in Greek telling me on one occasion that the Greek language in Revelation was hard to read. And it's the case that the way this Greek is assembled in this book is far different from the way John assembled it in his gospel account and in his missives. It's especially grammatically poor, it seems to me. And so the argument is made that this must have been written in John's early life when he didn't know the Greek so well. And since he was an Aramaic-speaking Jew, he really just hadn't learned Greek very well. And then at a time when his language had improved, he wrote the other epistle. The first man to make that argument for the date of Revelation was Dionysius the Great, A.D. 250. There's some force to that observation in my mind. But it seems to me, when I examine the argument, that the differences between what John early wrote and this, or later wrote, according to them, and then this early writing, have been exaggerated. There's a language difference, no doubt about it. But why would you resort to the theory of language improvement unless you had an early date bias going into the argument in the first place? The most common explanation is that the New Testament writing often made use of scribes or literary assistants of writing. Paul used Tertius, Romans 16:22. Peter used Silas, 1 Peter 5:12. Paul writes some things in Galatians by his own hand, Galatians 6:11. But it also has been pointed out that in some sections, Revelation is quite good Greek. How'd that happen? If John only knew poor Greek. Most of the solecisms, the difficulties, are in sections which are modeled, here's the problem, here's what caused this, on language of the Old Testament writers of apocalyptic. That's the reason for the grammatical differences here in Revelation. Our writer is using a model from the Old Testament and Intertestament periods that have to do with the writing of this kind of literature. I've already mentioned a second argument that the temple was still standing. And the commandment to John was to rise and measure the temple. And that is assumed to be the Jewish temple, which was destroyed by Rome in AD 70, no doubt about that. And so that would necessitate an early date, absolutely an early date, for the writing of this book. But the passage is obviously patterned after a similar incident in Ezekiel. And Ezekiel was accused of trying to destroy the priesthood because of what he wrote in chapters 40 through 46. But Ezekiel was accused of trying to destroy the priesthood because those who read the text did not understand that Ezekiel was writing about the church of Christ to come. He wasn't trying to write about the Jewish temple as still the problem. And so what we have in Revelation 11 is a spiritual application, as in all apocalyptic language. The temple that's in view here is the temple of the Church of Christ. 1 Corinthians 3:16. The temple which John was told to measure was not the one in Jerusalem, but the one in his vision, which he saw in Patmos. The early date folks also identify the woman sitting on the beast as Jerusalem. That's the Jewish nation now, sitting on the beast. That's Revelation 17 through 18:24. It's interesting that right in the middle of that revelation, though, at verse 11, that woman is sitting on 7 hills, not one. If you're going to take everything literally, you ought to take that one, I suppose. The woman is the same as that of chapter 12. Pictured now as fallen or apostate woman. In their view, the woman of chapter 12 is now fallen or apostate. The reasoning is that Rome, which most commentators think of as the more obvious or likely Domitian, has never stood in a spiritual relationship with God so as to fit the symbol of an apostate. Well, that view is doubtful for several reasons. There's nothing in the book that indicates that the two women are the same aspects of the same thing. The book doesn't indicate that. I don't find that. The main champion of this view is Alford. And so if you're following his commentary, you'll take the view that those women are the same. That is an apostate church, not an apostate Rome. And that the astonishment of John, according to Revelation 17:6, was because he saw that same woman apostate. But on the contrary, all the symbols used to describe the woman identify that wanton and persecuting city of Rome. The city sits on Rome's well-known 7 hills, 1711 and 9. Her universality is shown by the fact that she is mistress of peoples and crowds and nations and tongues. That's never true of the Jewish nation, 1715. Not true of Jerusalem at the time of the Jews or in the New Testament times. They were a subjugated people, not the ones in charge, while the woman like Rome rules over the kings of the earth, 1718. Nor do the descriptions of her persecution, drunk with the blood of the saints, 17:6, really describe the Jews who did offer local opposition to the church, but were not in a position to offer a large-scale persecution of the church in the time of Nero. They would have had no business doing that. They would have been put to death themselves. Finally, universal commerce, Revelation 18:10 through 19. And Sweet points this out in his commentary, offers the most pointed identification of Rome rather than the capital of the remote Jewish province as the center of trade and commerce in the first century world. However, some contend that harlot and fornication used to describe the woman were used figuratively always implies spiritual unfaithfulness or apostasy, and thus have to point to Jerusalem as the apostate church does not hold true. There is Old Testament precedent for the use of such terms to depict heathen cities. Tyre, Isaiah does, 23:15 through 17, and Nahum does for Nineveh, Nahum 3:4. And so it isn't true to say that that always refers to spiritual apostasy, because we have Tyre and Nineveh both spiritually apostatizing, if that's the case. I mentioned earlier that one of our brethren took the view from the Syriac Peshitta. That is an interesting Bible. Aramaic language is the idea. Peshitta means common, so you have a common Aramaic text. And it was probably the earliest translation into another language from Hebrew, or from Greek, excuse me. It's one of our earliest translations. Some argue that the Latin were, but they're about the same time. This is a 2nd century document. And this argument was used in one of our brethren's commentaries, that at the heading of chapter 1 in his Syriac Peshitta, written from Patmos, AD 68. And so he started from that premise to make his argument for the date of Revelation. That has had great force among my brethren over the years. And if that's a 2nd century, very early Syriac Peshitta, that would settle the argument forever, and should have. In fact, strangely, knowing what we know now, that argument is still made in some books. But that title in the Peshitta version of the New Testament supposedly came from AD 125. And such an early testimony is decisive, wouldn't it not be? But Miss Agnes S. Lewis in 1892 found a Sinaitic Syriac And that proves to us that the old Syriac version of the 2nd century is represented by the Sinaitic or Curetonian manuscript, and that the Peshitta that they were looking at was a 5th century revision by Bishop Rabula of Edessa, AD 411 to 435. In other words, they don't have an early heading there in AD 125 at all. It's a 5th century heading. And added in quite decisive fact against the contention is that the old Syriac version did not even contain the book of Revelation. The Syriac churches did not accept the Revelation until the 5th century. And so it's sad to me that so many of my brethren started with that Syriac Peshitta, put it in their commentaries as a strong argument, a decisive argument, and yet we know now from archaeological discovery that's a 5th century document. There's another argument for the early date called the Nero Redivivus. No, I said it right the first time. The idea that he lived again myth. And the evidence is that Revelation was written during Nero's reign because, according to some, that in the text it says he would return to life and reestablish himself in Rome. And the argument is generally that this death wound of the beast, which was healed, Revelation 13:3, refers to this legend. Hence, it is argued that the prediction would place the writing of the Revelation in Nero's time. Actually, the facts should be taken in the reverse order. I have no proof from the text that the legend current after the death of Nero was current during his lifetime. Hence, the theory actually supports the later date. That myth didn't occur until later on. This myth was during the Roman Empire, and we read it in the Sibylline Oracles, AD 120. That's a little late. But a date for the revelation in the time of Domitian fits the facts well of that point. Domitian was the second emperor to persecute the Christians. His persecution was actually a revival of Nero's policy. That's the point in Revelation 13:3. In this report, if this is the correct interpretation of the death wound, Domitian was Nero come to life. And so I have an argument there for the later date, not the early one. I'm reading one lately that's curious to me and a little difficult, really, to understand. But there's an argument made about the early date in a recent work on Revelation that the apocalypse was written before the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in AD 70, because by that date the list of New Testament books accepted as inspired scripture had been closed. That's mistaken. A number of New Testament books were written after that time. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, maybe John's Gospel, and so on. In fact, some have now dated Acts a little later than AD 70. I don't know about that. But we have books written after AD 70. And that's a strange argument to you. In fact, after the latest date for the writings of all the books, the canon wasn't closed for a long time. You have to move to AD 395 to find any council that said, that's it, that's the canon. And so this is a strange argument, but I think when you want to prove something, you might reach for that kind of thing. In my judgment, the case for the traditional dating of Revelation rests on good early evidence from Western Asia Minor. That's where John's residence was in his later life, Ephesus. We have seen that the objections raised against the writing of Revelation in Domitian's time are no reason for selecting the early testimony. The interpretation of Revelation ought to proceed on the assumption of the later dating. Let me read to you from Brother Haley's commentary, which I brought with me today, on this idea. And this will be a little tedious, but you can find his commentary, I'm sure. Homer Haley was a forbidding brother, was a professor at Florida University and so on, Florida College, excuse me. From the available evidence, it appears that Nero's persecution, this is page 30 of his commentary, was not aimed at the annihilation of Christianity, that it did not extend beyond Rome, and that he issued no formal edict against the Christians. This indicates that the attitude toward the Christians was not finally determined under Nero, but that the formal laws and edicts mentioned by Severus developed under emperors who followed Nero. State action against Christians developed in the empire within the period between AD 70 and 96. But even during this period, there seems to have been no imperial edict of proscription from any emperor completely outlawing Christianity. Domitian did. We know that from history. There can be no doubt that Nero's policy was continued by Vespasian and Titus, but there is no record of direct confrontation with Christians by either of those rulers. However, under Domitian, who was motivated by fear of conspiracy and by his insatiable desire for divine honors, the policy against any freedom of the individual or any opposition to despotism was carried to extreme. Ramsay thinks this policy against philosophic interests did not originate in mere capricious tyranny, but that the opposition to Christians was political. The action was against the church as an organized unity. Again, how do we unify the emperor? Well, we'll have to get them to worship the emperor. That's the impetus. That's the political impetus of Domitian's reign. We want unity, and they were having trouble holding it by military power. Domitian sought to restore the Roman cultus. We're going to learn a word, concilia, the priesthood of the Roman Empire and the Roman emperor, the concilia. Domitian sought to restore the Roman cultus and encourage worship of himself as Lord and God. That is from a book entitled Suetonius on Domitian. This reverence for the gods and the emperor was considered proof of loyalty to the empire. A refusal to pay this homage was considered sacrilege and treason. From Domitian's point of view, the issue was political. From the Christian's point of view, it was religious. In either case, the lines were drawn, and the conflict was to be long and bloody for the saints. The difference in the attitudes of Nero and Domitian toward divine honors and worship of themselves appears quite marked. And the harsh attitude of Domitian argues strongly for the later date of Revelation. Upon being declared emperor, Nero forbade statues to himself of solid gold and silver. That comes from Tacitus himself. Nero would not allow that. However, Tacitus does mention a bronze statue of the emperor was melted in a fire. Suetonius says he despised all religious cults except that of Atargatus, the Syrian goddess, to whom he sacrificed 3 times a day. Although Nero reveled in the plaudits of the populace and accepted worship as a god, he seems to have been somewhat restrained at deification by the general principle that divine honors are not paid to an emperor till he has ceased to live among men. That's again from Tacitus on Nero. That's the historical evidence. And since Nero loved life, he was in no way anxious to join the ranks of the dead deities. In sharp contrast to Nero's disposition, Domitian avidly courted the worship of himself by the people and wanted them to look upon him as a god. This disposition of Domitian and the spirit of his reign fits much better into the tenor of Revelation than the attitude of Nero. As will be pointed out in the section on internal evidence, the whole scheme of Revelation is that of a terrific conflict and struggle of moral and spiritual forces. Truth and loyalty to Christ are pitted against religious character and loyalty to a great ruling power. That's Brother Haley. My friend Robert Taylor Jr. wrote, AD 96, this is on page 14 of his commentary on Revelation. In fact, Brother Taylor took 2 years to study this book, Revelation. He says he read it every month for 24 months as he was working on this commentary. AD 96 is about the most accurate date that can be given. Irenaeus, a 2nd century church leader, wrote that the book of Revelation appeared near the end of Domitian's reign as emperor. Domitian was the son of Vespasian and brother of Titus, who were emperors before him. Domitian reigned from AD 81 to 96. Irenaeus knew Polycarp, who knew John the Apostle. Eusebius, 4th century Jewish leader, placed John's banishment to Patmos during the reign of Domitian. This corresponds to the AD 95-96 date for its composition. I do not agree, Brother Taylor wrote, with Revelation commentators who extend no importance to the writing date. Those who take the 6th decade of the 1st century as writing will usually contend that the book of Revelation focused on Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70. Many who take the AD 96 date, as I definitely do, will see the focus of Revelation as the fierce warfare the Roman Empire, and especially the Emperor Domitian, waged against Christ and his church. Rome, not Jerusalem and Judaism, had the widespread power to wage such a warfare. Jerusalem and Judea were too limited and much too confined to engage in such widespread warfare. The 7 churches in Asia were in the midst of this, and each one was far removed geographically from Jerusalem, the citadel of entrenched Judaism. Rome held sway over Western Asia Minor, not Jerusalem. I think my conclusion from all of that is that for my purposes, I think about this book being about Roman persecution of the church, not Jewish. And that would not change the point that there is a victory over persecution for Christians. But it certainly would take my view into a universal persecution of the church, not just a local one. And I will remind us again that this was written to 7 churches in Turkey, not Palestine, in Turkey. But when I think about the message of this book, I'm reminded of a poem that has to do with truth and error. And to the poet, it seemed like truth always seemed to be in the background. And he wrote, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold of truth sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. No matter the persecution, no matter if it seems like truth is not winning, God is always there, keeping watch above his own. That's our message in Revelation. Victory in Jesus. We win. That's the point. In the 4th century of the modern era, the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate camped his army north of Antioch of Syria. for 6 months training. They were headed east toward India to fight. Julian the Apostate had a Jewish friend who he had known in his boyhood. And he heard that that friend had a store in Antioch. And so on one occasion, this apostate who had ordered every Christian church closed, that is, the buildings, and all the pagan temples to him opened, decided to visit his friend. So he disguised himself, Julian the Apostate did, as a civilian. And he went into Antioch to find this old boyhood friend of his. And as Julian walked along, he saw all the pagan temples opened, worship to the emperor going on, hundreds going to worship. But he noticed that the churches of the Nazarene, as he called him, were closed. Julian the Apostate came to his friend's store. He walked in and they greeted one another, and he said, "When I came today into Antioch, I saw all the temples open to me, hundreds of worshipers. But his buildings are closed. What do you suppose Jesus of Nazareth is up to right at this moment?" Mocking his friend, of course. The man in the store, a Christian, looked the emperor right in the eye and said, "Jesus is building a coffin in which to bury your empire." Question: where is the Roman Empire? Daniel said that the stone cut out of the mountain could never be destroyed. Daniel 2:44. Our master went down into the Hadean realm and said, "When I come back out, I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not stop me." Matthew 16:18. Isn't that interesting? What's your master doing today? He's building a coffin. You remember he was a carpenter. In which to bury your empire. The teachings of Christianity led to Rome's downfall. And any immoral country is going to fall anyway. Those nations that forget God are turned into the pit, according to the psalmist. Well, where is the Roman Empire? Where's the church? I'm still in it, even today. In the early 1st century, there around Domitian's time, the emperor became God. The son of Vespasian, the brother of Titus, ordered all, Domitian did, worship me. Sat in the place of God thinking himself to be God, did he not? That's a Gnostic idea too. That's a Roman Catholic idea. I'm the representative of Christ on earth. No, you're not. You've never seen Jesus. The Jews had been long exempt. Why? Well, they were too prosperous and making too much money for the empire to be offended. And Rome didn't mind them, just one more God. But Christians became a severe problem. Their teaching was anti their gods, and they called the Christians atheists. They don't worship our gods. They don't worship our emperor. They refuse. That's a problem, because it was the political idea of Rome to be unified, and emperor worship was the unifying principle. Military power wasn't able to do it, keep them unified. Oh, it conquered the people, but unified? And Christians are a severe problem. In Smyrna and in the imaginary worship scene, you have a mention of that kind of problem. In fact, Tertullian, the 2nd century writer, quoted the Romans as saying of martyrs, "Behold how they loved one another." They couldn't understand it. There's some terrible things said about what Rome did to Christians. In Fox's Book of Martyrs, Foxe, apostrophe S, Book of Martyrs, they went so far as to cut open their stomachs and sew rats up inside. They wrapped animal skins around Christians and threw them in the arena to the lions, put grease on their bodies and lit them and used them as torches for their picnics. Polycarp was from Smyrna. Yeah, up there in Asia Minor, in Asia, that province. And they put him to death at age 85, and he wouldn't deny the Christ. He said, "He served me too well all my life. I'm not going to deny him now." And so they burned him at the stake. That's Rome. That's not Jewish persecution. Oh, there was persecution under Nero, but it was localized. But when Domitian came to the throne in AD 91, history tells us he wanted to be called emperor and God. Trajan, same thing, AD 108. Aurelius, AD 162, yes, same thing. AD 192, Severius, yes. Maximus, yes, AD 235. AD 249, Decius, yes. AD 257, Valerian, yes. Wanted to be called God, AD 275, Aurelian, yes. Diocletian, yes. The persecutions was stopped with Constantine. Never began again until papal Rome began in history. I would like for us to look at 11:11 at this moment. I think this is a key verse in this book. Excuse me, I said 11:15. This is the trumpet of the 7th messenger. And there were great voices in heaven saying, "The kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." Those being persecuted, martyred under Roman threat, had to be encouraged that their efforts were looking to a place that's better than life itself. Well, you know these Christians, they worship at night. Well, they worked all day. That aroused suspicion among the Romans, though. Why are they meeting at night? Seems like it's secret society, you know. And they eat their Lord when they get there. They're cannibals, you know. And they loved one another. You know what they're doing behind those closed doors. And you know what? And this is a matter of history. These Christians were refusing to take part in Roman wars. And so they were more persecuted. The oath of Roman service, brothers and sisters, required an oath to idols and the wearing of idolatrous insignia from the emperor. War. That was their main effort. War. When you think about Rome, you think about their legions and their Roman efforts to conquer the world. Eventually, the Roman emperors accused Christians of arson, causing famines. They caused earthquakes. All of our military losses were because of the Christians. War. One of the ancient German translations of the Bible was done by a man named Ulfis, U-L-F-I-S. It's called a Gothic Bible, and it's interesting. He left the book of Kings out of the Bible. When he was asked why he left it out, he said, "My people are already too warlike." Well, war. And so you have a people being persecuted by Rome who need some encouragement. And the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of Christ. We win. The author, John, he was sitting at the Last Supper when the Lord said, "Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will guide you into all truth, for he shall not speak of himself. Whatsoever he hears, that shall he speak, and he will show you things to come. He shall take of mine and glorify me." John 16, 13 and 14. And so, John the Apostle is the instrument of this text. From God to Christ to a messenger to John. Revelation 1, 1 and 2, verse 4, John. Verse 9, I, John, very clearly states who the author is of the material given by Christ. In chapter 2, verse 1, unto the messenger of the church of Ephesus, write. He's being told, write this. Revelation 1:29, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the churches. So John is getting a message from the Holy Spirit, guiding him into all truth about things which must shortly come to pass and are at hand. He was on the island of Patmos, that's out in the Aegean Sea, off the coast, the western coast of Turkey, chapter 1, verse 9. He was there because he had been testifying about Christ and he was arrested. He will live in Asia Minor in Ephesus about 20 years after Jerusalem fell. And so when he would attach his name to a document, these Christians in Asia Minor would know who he was. He's in Ephesus. They would not have known who he was early on. Now, according to chapter 2, verse 2, some who were claiming to be apostles were tried by the church at Ephesus. That's not a very difficult trial. All you'd have to say to a man who said he was an apostle, give me a spiritual gift. I received a call one day from a brother in Christ, a very faithful brother, great gospel preacher, Robert Williams. But at that time, he'd just been baptized, and he said, Brother Mosher, there's an apostle in my living room, or at least he claims to be an apostle. I said, see if you can keep him there. I'd like to talk to him. If he's really an apostle, we can test that. Well, when I got there, this gentleman began to teach me, as he put it, from John chapters 14, which was at the table of the Last Supper, and then 15 and 16 probably at the Mount Olivet. But nevertheless, what they were being taught were things for the apostles, not for him. But he was applying those passages just to the apostles, John 14:25, to himself. And he was claiming to be an inspired apostle. And so he kept on, and I didn't interrupt him, neither did Robert. And so this fellow just kept talking for the longest time. Finally, when he got done, I said, now you're claiming to be an apostle? He said, yes. I said, give me a miraculous gift. The gift of prophecy is the one I would like to have because I'm a gospel preacher and I try to teach the Bible. He put his hand on my forehead and prayed I'd get the gift of prophecy. I said, it's not working. He said, you don't have enough faith. I said, no, sir, you're not an apostle. If you were, strike me blind. Now, I took that from Elymas and Paul, of course. Well, he prayed I'd go blind, and that didn't work either. And so we tried to convince him eventually. But I said, sir, the qualification of an apostle, he must have seen Jesus in the flesh. Have you? Well, about that time he decided it was time to leave. That was sad to me because I was hoping, since he'd read some scripture, that he'd read some about what to do to be saved, that he would not stay. The one that wrote our text saw the Christ. Not only saw him, but heard him, studied him, and touched him. This is an eyewitness to Jesus. He knows who this voice is speaking to him. He has no doubt about it. This message that John sees now, he sees it as a vision, is directly from heaven. And it's about things shortly come to pass. There were false apostles in the early church, just as there are today. But John is a prophet, Revelation 22, 8 and 9, as well as an apostle. And Justin the martyr, when he was writing about Revelation 20, wrote, the Apostle John said. I have no doubt about my author. I have no doubt at all about the fact that this is a vision, and there's an important message for all of us, that in times of terrific persecution, we have to look to the fact that we will win through the Christ. I believe this book was written in AD 96 by John to those suffering under Roman persecution. Thank you for being here today and for studying this part with us.